So this is English composition. This is our second lesson in English composition. If you're watching this video, if you're attending a live class meeting online and you want credit for this lesson, you're going to need to take careful notes and submit those notes for credit. So in order to take good notes, and this is true for everyone here, what you should have on your paper with your notes, you should not doodle all over your paper. For your notes, at the top of your paper, you should write your name, you should write the date, you should write the name of the course, and the title of the lesson. So for this, it's English Composition Lesson 2. Okay, so have your name, the date, English Composition, and Lesson 2 at the top of your paper. So then your notes are labeled because you're going to submit those notes for your lesson credit. All right? And as I go through the lesson with your notes, your job is to take the most careful notes that you can, and that requires you to make some judgments. You can't write every single thing that I say, and if you try to do that, you may end up missing important points because you were writing something else. So don't try to write everything I say. Try to write a summary of what I say or an outline of what we study, and I'll try to keep notes on the board, which gives you a good guide as to what's important. So when you see me writing things on the board, those are probably the things that you should have in your notes, and I'll try to make sure that my notes on the board are clear so that your notes can be clear. Okay? And when class is finished, if you've taken good, clear notes, you should be able to submit those notes and get credit for the class and be done, be able to move on. So by paying attention and taking good notes, you can get your studies done very quickly, and I'll try to teach in a way that helps you to understand the lessons and take clean, orderly notes and understand all the content of the lessons. Okay, so make sure you take your notes clearly, because those notes are your assessment for this lesson in addition to your attendance. So this is English composition, and we've already studied one lesson, so this is English composition lesson 2. And in our textbook, we see the title of this lesson is Sources of Ideas. Sources of Ideas. In our first lesson, we talked about problems. Just at the top of your notes, let's just do a summary of, or a review of what we talked about in the previous class. We talked about problems in modern English classes, modern writing classes. Teachers create fake writing assignments. They ask students to write about subjects that they're not interested in. They ask students to write about subjects that they don't know anything about. And they ask students to write for audiences that aren't interested in their writing, or that they're not interested in writing for. And all of those problems make writing impossible. They don't teach students to write well. When we write in real life, we write about subjects that we're interested in. We write about subjects that we know a lot about. We write to people that we believe are interested in the same topic we are. And that makes writing pleasant. It makes it pleasurable, just like speaking. And the textbook talks about how when we talk to other people, we talk about subjects we're interested in, we talk about subjects that we know about, and that makes speaking pleasant to us. The same needs to be true in writing. That was the content of our first lesson. In this lesson, we see the title of the lesson is Sources of Ideas. So we're going to talk about where the information should come from that we're going to write about. Because again, in modern writing classes, students are often given wrong ideas about where writing comes from. Often students think that to be a good writer, you have to be imaginative and you have to be able to come up with stories and things like that. But we're going to learn that imaginative writing is a very small part of writing, a part of writing that we rarely ever do, and we can't allow imaginative writing to distract us from the English composition that we actually need to learn and use. So, lesson 2 here, we're going to study the sources of ideas. And I'm going to start by simply reading from our text here on sources of ideas. So I'm going to make the text available to students who are studying live online, and I'll read it for everyone who's here. So lesson 2, sources of ideas. We must have ideas before we can express them. And you should be taking notes, not just staring into space. This isn't a television show. This is a class that you're studying. We must have ideas before we can express them. We must have ideas before we can express them. And there are 3 sources from which ideas arise. 3 sources of ideas. So there are 3 sources of ideas we're going to discuss in this lesson. We may gain ideas from experience. So the first source of ideas will be experience. We may gain ideas from experience. Second, we may recombine ideas into new forms by the imagination. So the second source of ideas is our imagination. And going on, the third source of ideas, by conversation and reading, which the lesson just refers to as language. So there are 3 sources of ideas. 3 sources of ideas. So when we talk about English composition, when we talk about writing, we must have ideas before we write about them, because writing is simply the communication of ideas. We learned about that in grammar. And we see here that there are 3 sources of ideas. Experience, that is, things that we actually do. Our experiences. The work you do. Games you play. Activities you participate in. Things that you do. Your experiences are sources of ideas for your composition. And this relates to our first lesson, because you should write about things that you're interested in, your activities, your experiences, things that you're interested in. That should be what you write about. The second source of ideas is imagination, and it's important to understand something that our book said. Imagination is sometimes thought of as making stuff up, right? Make believe, making stuff up. But that's really not what our imagination does. It's impossible for you to imagine something that you've never experienced. It's impossible for you to imagine something that you've never experienced. Everything that you imagine requires that you have already seen it, heard it, felt it, tasted it, or learned it someplace else. Our imagination simply combines ideas from our experiences in new ways. So, for example, you've seen a rabbit, right? Every one of you can think of a rabbit and get in your mind the idea of a rabbit. But you can imagine a green rabbit. Can you imagine a green rabbit? Right? You've never seen a green rabbit, but you know what a rabbit is from your experience, and you know what it means for something to be green, and your mind can put those ideas together, and you can imagine a green rabbit. Even though you've never seen a green rabbit, You can imagine one, but you can only imagine it because you've seen a rabbit and you know what green is already. Okay? You understand that? So our imagination doesn't really make stuff up. Our imagination just combines ideas in new ways. So it still is based on your experience. Even though it's imaginative, it's still based on your experience. Okay? So the second source of ideas is imagination. And the third is by language. That is by learning from other people's writing. Learning other people's ideas. The third source of ideas, from reading, from conversations we have with people. We learn the ideas of others and they become part of our ideas. And when we learn other people's ideas and they become our ideas, we can then write about them. We can write about them as part of our own experience, or we can take their ideas and start to combine them and think about them in new ways and write about them from our imagination. So other people's ideas can become part of what we imagine, stories we make up. A good way to think about imagination is your dreams. If you have dreams, you know that dreams are pretty wacky. And sometimes you wake up and you think to yourself, how in the world do I think about those things while I'm dreaming? Where do dreams come from? And yet in your dreams, you never see anything in your dreams that you haven't seen in real life. But what happens? In your dreams, you see things from real life, but you see them in weird ways, right? Like the other night, I had a dream where I was in this house where we live now, and there were wolves outside. There are no wolves here where we live, so it's imaginative. There were wolves in our backyard, and I had to kill the wolves, but when I looked next door to our house, the people who were next door were the people who lived next door to me when I was a little kid. Not our actual next door. They were people that I lived next to 30 years ago, 40 years ago. You know? And that's what our minds do in dreams. We take these ideas, this idea of neighbors that I had in another house, in another state when I was a little kid, and we bring those neighbors, and we bring this house we live in now, and then we bring in some wolves, and now we've got this story in our dreams. It's imaginative, but all of the things in the dream are things that I've learned before and experienced before. All right? They're just combined in new ways. And that's pretty much what we do when we use our imagination. Okay? So 3 sources of ideas: experience, imagination, and language. That is, learning other people's ideas through writing or through speaking. Or I should say through reading or through speaking. Our lesson in the textbook goes on to say every day we add to our knowledge through our senses. And you don't have to think to do this. Your body does this. Your mind does this. Your mind is constantly adding to your knowledge through your senses. There's not a switch that you have to hit to turn on your nose or to turn on your eyes or turn on your ears. Your body is hearing things even when you don't pay attention. Your body is smelling things, feeling things, and so on. Your body, your mind is using the senses to add to your knowledge all day, every day, whether you're paying attention to it or not. All right? Every day we add to our knowledge through our senses. We see and hear and do, and we acquire ideas. We acquire ideas about things. These are the ones that we gain through experience. So this first source of ideas, experience, they're the ones that you're just constantly collecting. Your mind is constantly collecting them as you live and work and study and play every day. These are the ideas gained through experience. And by far the greater part of our expression has to do with ideas we gain from experience. So most of the things that you're going to write about, the most important source of ideas is your personal experience. Most of what you write about, most of your composition is going to be based on your experiences. And then the text tells us that the first chapter of this book is concerned with the expression of ideas that come to us through experience. And again, why is that important? I want you to keep thinking about this theme that we learned in the first lesson. Because in order to write well, we have to write clearly, we have to write effectively, and we want to take pleasure in our writing. And in order for us to write clearly and effectively and take pleasure in our writing, we have to write about subjects that are interesting to us. We have to write about subjects that we know a lot about, that we can actually share information about. And we want to do so in a way that allows us to share our ideas with an audience who we know will be interested in them. That's what makes for good writing. The things that you do in your experiences are most likely the things that you enjoy and are interested in, and the things that you know a lot about. If I asked you to write an essay about going to the Philadelphia Zoo, would you be able to write that essay? No, because you've never been there. Or you might not even like animals and not want to think about going to a zoo. So the most important source of ideas in our writing is going to be our own personal experience. In the next paragraph, we read about imagination and ideas that come from imagination. We may think about things that have not actually occurred. We may think about things that have not actually occurred. That doesn't mean we're lying, right? Using the imagination and telling a story doesn't mean we're lying. When we tell a story or write imaginatively, we usually make it clear that this is an imaginative story, right? Lying is a way that we use our imagination to tell a story that's false. That's not what writing by imagination necessarily means. We may write about things that have not actually occurred. We may allow our minds to picture a football game that we have not seen, or plan a story about a boy who never existed. How would we do that? Remember, in order to write about a football game, you have to have experienced a football game. Even if you write about a football game that you didn't see, you tell an imaginative story about a football game, you can do that because you've experienced a football game. Right? That's why even if you want to write an imaginative story, if you're trying to write a story about something you've never experienced, like if you want to write a story about a dog fight in a war between pilots, and you've never been a pilot and you've never been in a plane, you really don't know the details of what it's like to be in a dogfight, and it will make it difficult for you to write that story. So when you watch a story, and if you read a story or watch a movie and it's about, soldiers in a war, the only way that a good movie can be made is if the people making the movie actually have experience in the things they talk about. Otherwise, it's not realistic. And you know what it's like to watch a movie when the movie's about something that you know and it's not very good, and you say, oh, this is so cheesy, right? That's why sports movies are usually terrible, because they have actors in sports movies and the actors can't even throw a ball, and it looks ridiculous. It's hard to act or imagine or tell a story about things you've never experienced, because people who have experienced them are going to know that they're not credible. Nearly everyone takes pleasure in such an exercise of the imagination. We like to imagine things. Everyone takes pleasure in exercising their imagination. In the second chapter of this book, we're going to study the expression of ideas that come from our imagination. All right, and next, we also add to our knowledge through the medium of language. We also add to our knowledge through language, by reading, by speaking with people. That's why interviews are interesting. Wouldn't you like to sit down and have a conversation with one of the men who captured Osama bin Laden? Wouldn't you like to sit at a coffee table and just be able to ask questions and talk and learn from his experience through conversation? Wouldn't you like to read the journals of a man who fought in the Civil War? You know, where he wrote down notes daily about what was going on and what he saw, what he experienced. Maybe he drew illustrations of battle scenes and things like that. We like to get ideas from other people who have had experiences that we have not had. Wouldn't you like to talk to one of the astronauts who walked on the moon? It's an experience you've never had, right? Would you like to have an interview with a person who rode a bike one time? No, because you've had that experience yourself. You're not interested in reading or talking about riding a bike because everybody knows that. But when you learn that someone did something really interesting that you've never done, that's the kind of person we want to talk to. Would you like to be able to talk to Christopher Columbus about what it was like to sail across the ocean? That'd be a pretty cool conversation. And so you can see what kind of information we're looking for, what kind of information we're interested in. We don't want to just talk to anybody. We don't want to talk about any subject. We don't just like talking to people for the sake of talking to people. We like talking to people who have experiences that we don't have, who have experiences in things that we're interested in, but we don't have their experience in, because we like to learn from their experiences. What was it like when so-and-so, right? What were you thinking when so-and-so? When there's a championship game on television and a team wins a Super Bowl or a basketball championship, what they always ask the players and the coaches is, what's going through your mind right now? What are you thinking right now as you think about this championship? We're interested in knowing about their experience, an experience that we've never had before. That's what's interesting to us. But we're interested in it. Okay? We add to our knowledge through the medium of language, through conversations, through reading. We learn what other people think. And it's often valuable to restate their ideas or to use their ideas in our own writing. I can use illustrations, for example, to make my writing more clear by sharing a story that my grandfather taught me about his life growing up on a farm. The story that he told me becomes a part of my ideas, and I can use it in writing. If I read a book in the Bible and I learn a helpful parable from Jesus, once I read and learn that parable, that becomes part of my ideas and becomes part of my writing. I can use it to communicate clearly and share my own ideas. All right? Through conversation with people and through reading, we learn what others think. And it's often valuable to us to share those ideas we learn from other people. And in the third chapter of this book we have on composition, we study communicating ideas that we gain through language, through conversation, and through reading. Now what this also tells you is when you have conversations with people, what should you be trying to do? One thing that people always say is, oh, I hate small talk. I hate small talk. And what small talk is when, let's say you meet somebody for the first time and you don't know anything about them, you don't know anything to talk about, and it's very awkward, right? You just don't know anything about their life or what they do or their interests. And so small talk is, so, weather's pretty nice today, huh? And you don't have anything to talk about, right? That's called small talk. So if you think about how conversation can be helpful, how can conversation be helpful? It helps you to understand what you should do when you talk to people. When you meet someone new, it's good to ask them, where are you from? What do you do for a living? What are you interested in? And then when they start to share some of their own background and experience and their interests, that can give you some ideas about things to talk about, right? If you meet someone at church and you're at youth group and there's a man there and the man says hello and he's helping out for the night and you say, oh, hi, what's your name? What do you do for a living? And he says, oh, I'm an astronaut. Okay, well, now I've got some questions I'd like to ask, right? You're an astronaut? What does that mean? What kind of astronaut? What do you do? Right? So by asking what the person does, we're not being nosy. We're not just collecting information because we want to know how much money he makes or something like that. We ask, what do you do? What are you interested in? Because that's how useful conversation can start. Right? Just think about if you met someone and they asked you, what are you interested in? What would you say? Would you say, I like sticks? Right? I like rocks? That's not what you would say. You would actually try to think of the most interesting thing that you're interested in. Right? You'd say, oh, I'm interested in guns. I'm interested in, I like to go fishing. I like to play sports. I like to work out. I go to the gym. I like to swim. If someone says, what do you want to do when you grow up? The reason why they ask that question is because they're trying to learn about what you're interested in. Because that's how conversation starts. Right? If they say, what are you interested in? And you say, oh, I'd like, or what do you want to do when you grow up? And you say, oh, I'd like to join the military. I'd like to be a soldier. I'd like to be a Navy SEAL. Then that person can say, oh, you know what? That's interesting. I was in the Navy. And then you have something to talk about. So when you're asked those questions, that's why people are asking. We're looking for something interesting to talk about. We'd like to know what you have experience with. Because that's where a good conversation comes from. And you should do the same things. You should seek to know other people's experience. Right? If someone says, if you ask someone, where do you live? And they say, oh, I just moved here. I just moved from France. Well, that's interesting. Tell me about France. Where did you live in France? Where did you go to school in France? What did you do in France? I'd like to know about France. And that's what makes conversation useful. All right? When we have conversations with people, we're not just wasting time. Just talking nonsense, not small talk. We have to learn how to use conversation to gather ideas, right? Because when we have a conversation with someone, we have an opportunity to learn something that we might not be able to learn anywhere else. And what I want you to think about is that's what makes the conversation interesting. That's what makes writing interesting. Because this third source of ideas, pay attention to this for a minute. This third source of ideas is like where you read other people's composition, whether it's spoken or written. And you see what makes composition interesting. Their experiences, things that they do that interest you, things that they know a lot of information about. That's what makes their writing or conversation interesting. That's what makes composition interesting. You see that? Because when you're writing, you're doing this for someone else. That's what your writing is. If you give a speech or even participate in a conversation, you are sharing your ideas through language. So Remember the golden rule I said is the rule for all composition, all communication. Think about conversation that you would be interested in with someone else and realize that in composition, you're being the person who's sharing. You should share in the same way you would like other people to share. It's that simple. What would make for an interesting conversation if you were to talk to someone else? The question is, can you provide interesting conversation for someone else? What should you talk about? What are you interested in? What do you have experience with? What do you know a lot about? What can you share with other people that allows their ideas gained through language to be valuable? Just turn this around and think of it in the other direction, and you'll understand what makes for good composition. Okay? So, this is a simple lesson. That's all that's in this second lesson. At the end of your notes, you should write a summary. Usually in the assignments, I ask you to write a brief summary of the lesson, right? So let's write a little summary of what we've learned. We started off with a review. And we talked about the problems in modern writing classes, that students are asked to write about topics they don't know about, they're not interested in, and they're asked to write to audiences that aren't necessarily interested in their ideas. And we know that. So modern writing classes, modern writing programs, they usually don't help us learn to write well. They don't make writing pleasant. Writing should be pleasant. If we do it right, it will be pleasant. And so the first thing to think about in this chapter, we got into thinking about the sources of ideas. Where can our ideas come from? Often when people are told to write about something, they say, I can't think of anything to write. I can't think of anything to write. If you can't think of anything to write, then you're writing about a topic you shouldn't be writing about. Huh? If someone came to me and said, hey, can you write something about farming? Am I going to have a hard time thinking about what to write? No. Right? If someone said, can you write an essay about playing baseball? Am I going to have a hard time thinking about what to write? No. If someone says, can you write an essay about women's dresses? I don't know what to write. I can't think of anything to write. I shouldn't write about that topic. All right? So where should our sources of ideas come from? Where should our ideas come from? They should come from experience, or they do come from experience. I shouldn't say they should come from experience. They do come from experience. We should also think about our experiences because we control many of our experiences. If you sit and watch some useless movie, some dopey, silly movie, rather than something helpful, you fill your mind with ideas that you're not even going to be able to use, and that time could have been used to learn some ideas that would be useful. So the way that you use your time affects your experiences. First source is experience. And our minds are constantly gathering information. The second source is imagination. And like I said, imagination doesn't mean we just make stuff up. That's not true. People think about imagination like that, but that's not how imagination works. In our imagination, we simply combine ideas in new ways. Ideas we already have. And thirdly, through language, by conversation with other people, by reading other people's writings, we gather their ideas and add them to our ideas. And what it means to be a smart person, what it means to be smart, is to work to gather ideas that are useful, right? Many people have minds that are filled with ideas that are useless. All kinds of silly nonsense. If you talk to other people and they look at you and say, no one cares about that. No one cares. We don't care about that. You're probably gathering ideas that you shouldn't be gathering. And so we control our ideas because we control the sources of our ideas. So not only is this helpful to think about for composition, because we can think about where our ideas come from, it's also helpful for life, because if you'd like to be a good writer, then you should live a life that allows you to collect the best ideas. I'll tell you a quick story about Virgil, the Roman poet. He's considered one of the greatest poets who ever lived, and he wrote the story of the Aeneid that we're going to study in English literature. How long do you think it took Virgil to write the Aeneid? It took him over 20 years. He worked on the Aeneid, the story that he wrote, the poem that he wrote. He worked on it for over 20 years. And when you read it, you have to ask yourself, where does he get all these ideas from? Where does he get all these ideas from? And sometimes we think that the poet just sits around and imagines things. But he talks about traveling across the seas. He talks about foreign countries, distant lands, distant peoples. He talks about all of these foreign things. Can you imagine foreign people? No, you can't imagine foreign people and tell a realistic story. Virgil actually traveled to see things and collect ideas for the sake of his poem. He actually went and chose experiences to have so that he could have ideas that he could use in his composition. And he's a good example to us of why we don't simply write from our experiences. We also control our experiences. You know? If you've got two choices between books you can read, one that's just sort of a lazy, easy book about nonsense, and one that offers to you ideas that are new and can be useful, you have to learn to choose to read the second book. If there are two movies to watch, one that's just silly nonsense for an hour, and another one that can help you to gain some new experience, you should choose the second one, because that's actually improving your ability to write and speak by allowing you to gather new ideas that are actually useful. All right? So to become a good writer, you have to live and make decisions that will allow you to become a good writer. All right? So 3 sources of ideas: experience, imagination, and language. And over the next lessons, we're going to work through these one by one. We're going to start focusing on how to write, how to compose using our experiences. Then we'll study how to write from our imagination, and then we'll write how to use language and communication to gather more ideas to help us with our composition. So that's all for lesson 2 in English composition. Now, in your notes, you should take a minute to look over your notes, make sure everything is clear. Make sure you've got everything in your notes that you want in your notes, because those notes are the proof of your attendance for this class, and they're proof of your understanding of the content of this lesson. So if you've got just chicken scratch and some baby notes or some words written here or there, you're not going to get credit for the class. Make sure your notes are clear and complete. Make sure you've got a heading at the top of your page, your name, today's date, the name of the course, and the lesson title. And if you've got all that together and you think it looks pretty good, then you need to submit a copy of those notes for credit for this lesson. All right? So that's lesson 2 in English composition.